Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable the Dean of Economics and Business Faculty of Universitas Brawijaya, the Honorable the Chairman of 3-in-1 Program, Associate Professor Dr. Asfi Manzilati, and the Honorable our great speaker today, Associate Professor Dr. Gulzar Ramal, and all distinguished participants. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our speaker today. He is a co-editor of Review of International Business and Strategy since 2015. He is also the founder editor of Emerging Issues in International Business and Global Strategy, and Real Impact editor in Journal of Knowledge Management and many journals others. And he also has 43 papers published since 2003. Well, our topic today is tips to help improve the qualitative paper publication in Scopus journals as an editor's perspective. Actually, conducting and publishing qualitative research requires the same principal skill as quantitative research. But on the other hand, there are maybe special challenges for qualitative researchers. They may have to overcome communication barriers within the scientific community. And before we start the main program, let me remind us about the quantitative and qualitative first. So in quantitative research, actually the observation typically follow a systematic scheme whereby the classification of the observation is already determined to a large extent when the data collection starts. And this makes it possible to gather large data sets for numerical analysis. But the understanding of the findings will be restricted by the concept on which the collection of data was based. And however, qualitative research in which the observation like text, sounds, behavior, image are usually fewer. And the researchers preconception of social phenomenon does not determine the research result to the same extent as in quantitative research. And qualitative research also is often used to study social processes or the reason behind the human behavior, or as why and how of social matters more than the what, where, and when that are often central in quantitative research. Then, while facing these difficulties of publishing the qualitative research in reputable journal is being our big problem. And here is the tip from Associate Professor Dr. Ramal as the editor in several reputable journals. So time and screen is yours, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, distinguished guests, committee members and participants. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my tips. I'll just share my screen. As Sylvie mentioned, my background or my experience comes from the fact that not just an author, but I've also been on the other side as an editor of Scopus journals. All the journals listed on the screen are Scopus journals. If you wanted to think of them in terms of Q1, most of them are Q1 or Q2 journals, depending again, if you're looking at Scopus or if you're looking at Scimago. So I've got 10 tips that I will share today. And some of them are broader. It's not just on qualitative, but the tips essential for qualitative, I will go into more detail. Now, as part of this, I'm hoping what we can do is also share some experiences, because the experiences I have as an author and as an editor may be similar to what you have or different. So I would encourage you to ask questions. We'll have some time for it, but also where possible, please share your experiences through the chat box or later on during the discussion questions. It would just be nice for us to understand what are some of the barriers we've been facing in publishing. So let's start with the publishing process itself. I think the very first thing we have to do is try and figure out what are we trying to do. So what is the idea? Why are we doing this research? That is very important, because if we can't justify that, it's very hard for a reviewer or an editor to accept the paper. It doesn't matter if it's a qualitative or it's a quantitative paper. The idea has to be something that is new, that is unique. So that's the very first thing we have to do. So going with the purpose of the study, I would like us to think in terms of the studies we are conducting at the moment, papers we may have. Think where your paper would fall in one of these categories. Are you studying a phenomena at the moment that's taking place? Are you addressing a gap in the literature? Or are you developing or extending theory? Let me go through these one by one. Now, for the last 2 years, we've all been concerned with COVID-19, the pandemic. So if you're studying something that's pandemic related, that would be considering a current phenomena. Okay? If you were studying how technology is affecting traditional businesses, that's again a phenomena. So let me give you an example. Right now, if you take COVID apart, one of the phenomena that's of real interest is the future of accounting as a profession. Many World Economic Forum and many other bodies have said accounting in the current form will not exist because technology will take over, machines will do much of the accounting work in the future. So there is a lot of studies taking place that are talking about how do we define and understand accounting and what will be the future of the accounting area. If you're doing that phenomena-based study, then you're not really going for a quantitative. You're trying to go more for an exploratory, potentially qualitative research where you talk to people. So we need to really understand what we're studying. Okay? Are you addressing a gap in the literature? So for example, there may be a lot of studies about economies in the West, and they haven't really done something about a particular phenomenon. Let's take, for example, a few years ago, entrepreneurship was a very Western concept. So all the studies were coming from entrepreneurship in the Western environment. Then suddenly we started seeing a lot more studies come out of China, come out of other parts of Asia about entrepreneurship in those areas. That's trying out a new idea. Okay? You can do a quantitative or a qualitative, depending on how established that field is. Or are you trying to extend a theory? Are you trying to take a theory and see whether it's got relevance in a different context? Resource-based view, if you take that as a theory, it's always spoken about the assets that organizations have. And we've got the whole thing from Jay Barney and other researchers who've spoken about it. Now, if you're going to take the resource-based view and say, I want to see whether knowledge can be a key resource for the organization, then you're developing or extending the theory. In that case, again, a qualitative research may not be a bad idea. And that's how the knowledge-based view came about. That's how a new theory or the extension of the theory evolved. So we have to be very clear where the contribution will be. And what we need to do is go with our very first tip for that. Once you know what your idea is going to be, before you start writing it, you write a whole paper, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 words, don't do that. Don't rush. Take your time, develop the idea, go and speak to senior colleagues. Ask them if they could give you feedback. Okay. So put it this way. The way I tell my PhD students to pursue this is come up with an idea, speak to me, I'm the supervisor, that's fine, but go and find people you've never spoken to, other researchers, senior colleagues who haven't spoken to you. They could be from your field, or they could even be from other fields, but have a general knowledge about business. You get 2 minutes to 3 minutes to explain to them what your idea is, just the idea, we're not talking about methods. If in that 2 to 3 minutes you can talk to them, convince them it's a good idea, then it's worth pursuing. If you can't in 2 to 3 minutes, then you need to go back and fix it. Because your idea should be so clear and precise that you can explain it in 2 to 3 minutes. What we don't do is take the time, we rush. And I can understand why we rush. We've got pressures for publishing, so we rush it. But it's better to have well-developed research ideas, which can then be completed faster than unstructured, rushed ideas that will take much more time to clear and then submit. The other tip I would say is, just because something hasn't been studied previously, you just don't give that as a reason for studying it. Okay, so something you go, well, they haven't studied this in Singapore, or they haven't studied this area. Well, you have to justify why it's important. Maybe it hasn't been studied because it's not important. Maybe others have thought of it and got the feedback and said, well, it's quite similar globally, it won't make an impact. Okay? So it's very important not to think just because it hasn't been done, it's going to be unique. It has to be more than just that as an explanation. Okay, so let's move on further. What else do we need to do? Once you've got your idea, and this is again before you write, choose a journal. Obviously, you're looking at Scopus journals, right? But within the Scopus journal, are you targeting a specific journal? Okay. How are you deciding which journal is best suited for you? Is it because that journal has published studies that are related to what you're covering? Or is it because the journal is ranked very highly? You can have different criteria for it. But whatever you do, you have to make sure that it's relevant to your research and it's relevant to your methodology. Okay? A good example of this would be if you choose, let's say, one of the top economics and finance journals. Just because it's an economics and finance journal, you'd like to publish in there, well, that's not a good enough reason for it. They may not publish papers in your area. They may not publish quantitative or qualitative papers. They may only publish quantitative papers. So you have to be very strategic in which journals you choose. Fairly straightforward, but here's my tip number 2. Don't just search for one journal. Plan for backup journals. The way I was taught by my supervisor, and I say this to my students as well, create an Excel sheet. And in that Excel sheet, have a column which is about the title of your paper, and then have journal 1, journal 2, journal 3. Choose at least 3 journals. And that will be based on your preference. Journal 1, you submit there. If it fails, you go to journal 2. If that fails, you go to journal 3. And if that fails, you then choose other journals. You don't stop. But every time you get rejected, you see what the reasons are and you work on it. And we'll talk more about it a bit later. But have a plan, have a backup plan. Don't write just with one journal in mind, so that when it gets rejected, you're spending months and months trying to search for another alternative. Be very strategic, plan ahead. The other thing is, don't expect your feedback or review results to come back very quickly. Okay? And the reason for that being, especially now with COVID as a real issue, there's long lead times. So if a journal says to you, it may take us 2 months, 3 months for review, be prepared for 4 months perhaps for the review process to take place. Again, plan accordingly. Don't just go, this is the only paper I have. And related to that, I would say, backup journal plans also have a pipeline. Don't just work on one paper. Okay, as a PhD student, you may be doing that. But as you go more into the academic world, don't just have one paper at a time. Have a pipeline, because sometimes journals can take a long time to review. and you just don't want to rely on that one journal. And check whether the journal actually publishes in the methodology that you are applying. Perhaps they don't, and that's okay. Some journals have that clear perspective on it. Okay? So let's get into some of this discussion, and Sylvie very rightly pointed out some of these issues of what is the qualitative versus quantitative things. Okay? Now, this argument is ongoing. What we have to understand is that qualitative is a more recent phenomenon when it comes to publications, especially in journals that claim to be more on the social sciences and science-focused area. Now, when you take that as a point and you go, well, I will never be able to publish in a science-related journal, and I mean social sciences or medicine, you can forget that. That's not a valid reason anymore. If you look at some of the top qualitative methodology papers and books, they come from the medical area, health sciences, nursing area. They're the ones that do a lot of research in trying to understand how patients work. They interview patients, they interview a lot of healthcare workers. So qualitative research has a strong grounding there. Some journals will not publish it, and that's quite okay. So there are some, especially North American journals, that have a tendency not to publish qualitative papers. And these are more the well-established historic journals that have not moved towards qualitative. We find them mainly in economics and finance. The other disciplines in like accounting, marketing, etc., they have moved a bit more towards qualitative, more accepting of it. Okay. However, there are many, many economics and finance journals that will take qualitative papers as well. It all comes down to what you are studying and whether that matches your study. So, what are some of the reasons qualitative papers get rejected by journals? Well, the common misconceptions are that qualitative research is less robust and less reliable. Why is that the case? If you take the leading journals now, be it economics, accounting, whichever it is, many of these Scopus journals will say when you submit whether you want your data in brief presented there. And essentially what they want you to do is make your data available online. In the past, they didn't ask for it because journals were published in print. If you take Emerald as a publishing house, Emerald does not publish any of its journals in print anymore. It's all online printing, unless you request for it specifically, which you would have to pay for extra. Now, because it's online publishing, you can have files uploaded online. And journals are asking for quantitative researchers to make their Excel files, data files available online. So others can try and replicate that study and see if they get the same results. Since that's happened, you've seen in the last few years, there have been corrections that journals have published. Some papers had to be withdrawn because they didn't follow up or follow the steps that the data was telling them to do. There's a bit of data mining going on. Now, with qualitative research, that is much harder to do. So it's seen to be less reliable simply because you can't really replicate it. Journals will ask if you can make your interview data available online. And in many instances, researchers will say no, because there's confidentiality agreements in place. So it is seen to be less robust. Journal editors, the traditional journal editors, will therefore be a bit more worried about it. The second reason will be you can have very good quantitative papers that have 300, 400 survey observations or 20 years data. And then you may have some qualitative researchers that are research that is based on 4 or 5 interviews. So again, as an editor who is not familiar with the qualitative research, it seems to be less in terms of data. It's not sufficient data to make generalizations. And that is a common mistake. We don't try and make generalizations with qualitative data, but you can with quantitative. So again, there's a difference there. And the third reason is, what's the justification for doing a qualitative research? The justification can't be that I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'll do qualitative research. It has to be based on what is the purpose of your study. So I think these are some of the key reasons that come up. Okay? So, and I would be very interested in what you've had as reasons given to you. So if you have any reasons that you've received rejections, please do type them in the chat. It'd be really good to hear your views and your experiences as well. So here comes my tip number 3. Match your research question and your methodology. And this is why I said in tip 1, be very clear what is the purpose of your study. Even if you don't explicitly state it at the start of your study, at least in your mind, you need to know what are you studying. As Sylvie said, if it's a how and why question, you're going towards a qualitative study. You've justified it, you've linked it. But if it's a study about how much, whether this particular variable influences something or this phenomena influences this, to what extent, then you have to employ quantitative methods. The worst thing we can do is try and answer a quantitative question with a qualitative approach. And you'll see there are some studies that manage to get published, not in very good journals, but they try to test propositions. Propositions are provided as something you can test in other studies in the future. If propositions are being tested in your own study, then you're trying to mask hypotheses as propositions, okay? If the literature is telling you these are relationships, and those are hypotheses, these are not propositions. So let's be very clear on what we're doing. It has to be methodology suits the research question, not a case of the research question has to suit the methodology I like, okay? And this should be about your own nature. Do you have curiosity to understand why people do things? Why is this process taking place? Or are you trying to understand how much does this process influence the outcome? Different mindsets, different curiosity. If you can't justify and link your research purpose and methodology, reviewers and editors will not be sympathetic towards it. So you will automatically either get a rejection or being given a major revision, if you're lucky, to fix the methodology. That becomes a big issue. Pardon me. So I would say these are some of the key tips, 3 key tips that you have to think about. So a few more to go. So let's continue on. So many of you may already be qualitative researchers. Generally, where do we get things wrong? Let me ask you a simple question. And if you would like, I would really encourage you to type an answer in the chat if you can. What would be the minimum number of interviews you would need for a study to be published? If you want to type an answer, be very interested in seeing what you think. If someone says to you, you have to go and do interviews, what do you think would be the minimum number of interviews you would need to do? Now, let's say you're doing a quantitative study and someone says to you, you have to do a survey. Then in that case, I would ask, what is the minimum number of surveys you would need to do in order to make it reliable? Okay, so someone has put in the chat 100 interviews. If you can get 100 interviews, you should be publishing in the top journal. That would be fantastic. Okay? Now, this becomes a question because if you take the quantitative side of things, there are formulas. There are formulas where you can say that if the population is this large, using this particular model, I can say, or this particular formula, I can say I need 120 or I need 180. Depends on the population, depends on the number of variables, depends on the regression model I'm using. If you're doing a qualitative research, it should be, and there's a good reply there, depends on the research question or the model we have. Well, if you're doing a qualitative one, it depends on the population you have. So if you are looking at, so if you're trying to find out how auditors conduct their audit in financial services sector, then you have to see how many auditors are there, how many banks are there, how many financial services organizations are there, and then select the best amongst them that you can. And again, there are some studies that are suggesting formulas saying, oh, anything over 20 to 30 should be reasonable. There are some that say anything 6 or more is reasonable. It just depends how you can justify it. But you have to justify it. It's no longer a case that we were only able to get that many people. That's where qualitative research gets in trouble. So we have to plan for this. If we know that it's a big population, then you have to interview a lot more. Okay? Let me give you an example. So say you're sitting in Brawijaya. Now, I don't know how many multinational or international architecture firms are there. But imagine there are 4 firms that actually design buildings in Indonesia and outside. Well, then if there are 4, you want to capture all 4 of them. You'll interview 2-3 people because architecture firms are usually not that big. So maybe 12 to 15, up to 20, just depends how many architects are there. That should be enough interviews. Okay? So it depends on the population there. But we never justify it. If you look at the qualitative research that I receive in journals, qualitative researchers just mention they interviewed 16 people or 20 people. There's no justification for it. So first thing I would say is plan for it. Plan the data collection. How are you going to analyze it as well? Have a plan for it. Second thing is, be very clear why you're doing it and how. Okay? What did you do? How did you collect the data? And why did you apply this method? Okay? So why did you choose the interviews rather than focus groups? Why did you choose interviews rather than just looking at documentations and doing a content analysis? Right? So there has to be an explanation for it. Why interviews, for example? Why not other forms? Qualitative has many other forms. Why do we, it's like quantitative. Why do people do surveys when there's data already available? Depends on the needs for it, then they have to explain it. Same thing for qualitative researchers. Don't assume automatically because you're doing qualitative research, it has to be interviews. Okay? There are other forms of data that's available qualitatively. And the third thing we do, which puts off an editor or a reviewer, is we use an apologetic language. We kind of explain the need for doing qualitative research to say there wasn't enough time or there wasn't enough resources to undertake a quantitative study. We kind of apologize and say we're doing qualitative because we just didn't have enough time to do the quantitative. That's, again, not a reason. That's a very, very poor situation you've got. So you have to be very clear on why you're doing it. And it has to come from a viewpoint of confidence and justified viewpoint. Why are you doing it? You're doing it because this is the best way that's possible. Okay? You're not doing it because it's the easy way. Qualitative research is no easier than quantitative or vice versa. So here's my tip number 4. Explain your approach. Detail the steps you're following. Okay? I did this, I did this, I did this, this is why I did it. You don't have to do this in quantitative research because you can quite simply say, following so-and-so's approach, we've done this. But let me ask you this, how many of you are using case study? And if you are using case study, how many of you have heard about Yin, right? Everyone tends to use Yin's case study. Now, if you just say, we followed Yin's case study, that's not going to be sufficient. So qualitative just can't say I'm using Yin's case study because Yin says there's so much flexibility. Are you using a single case study? Are you using a longitudinal case study? Are you using an embedded case study? All right. So I gave you the example of architecture firms in Brawijaya. There'll be architecture firms in other parts of Indonesia. Are you going to take those 4 architecture firms in Brawijaya as one case study, embedded, Brawijaya architecture sector, 4 firms embedded inside that? That's an embedded case study. Or are you going to take each firm as a separate case study? And if so, then where does the context of Brawijaya come in? So we have to be very clear. You have to provide detail. A methodology section in a qualitative research paper has to be more detailed than a methodology in a quantitative research paper. That's just a given. And provide context. You are in a very good position. Think about the research that has been done over time. We used to have studies going back 50 years ago. All the studies, actually more than just, I'd say up to 75 years ago. Most of the studies were done on the USA and Western Europe because they were the leading economies. Then we saw a huge number of studies being done on Japan. When the interest from Japan ended, or there was enough studies done, there came the turn for China and then India. If you look at it now, and if you talk to researchers and journal editors, they'll say, this is the time now that we need to learn about the other places. Indonesia is one of them. Latin America is another one. Africa is another one. We don't have enough studies to understand how things are done there. So here's your advantage. You already have the Indonesian context, okay? But here is where we get it wrong. We don't explain why Indonesia is unique. I'm not in Indonesia. I get a paper that says, I did this study in this region of Indonesia. I'm going to say, why this region? What's so important? Indonesia itself is so interesting, but that paper hasn't told me anything about why Indonesia should be studied, why this phenomena should be studied in this part of Indonesia. This is your selling point. So don't underplay it. Have a section on it which provides the context, and that can help you justify why you need the study, or at least have a couple of paragraphs within the methodology to say, this is what I studied, this is where I studied, this is why it's important. Okay? It's very significant to do that, especially for those of you who are more into the tourism sort of area, tourism economics or health economics. That context is very important. It's quite significant. Okay? So keep that in mind as well. So continuing on. Next tip number 5. Make your study replicable. Okay? Now, many of you are in a research methodology class, so many of you would be doing a master's or a PhD in research. And the very first thing you would have done or are doing is your literature review, just finding out where the gap is. You're going to spend the first few months, even a year of your research life, familiarizing yourself with the literature, writing a big literature review. What are we going to do about that? Are you just going to leave it as a chapter in your thesis, or are you going to publish it? Okay, the phenomena now is you try and publish your literature review, which you will do it in a very structured manner. And even there are journals that will publish only literature reviews. Okay? Now, if you're going to try and submit a literature review paper, It has to be very clear in the process, and it has to be done in a way that others can follow it. It has to be replicable, what we call the systematic literature review. Now, if literature reviews are being pushed by journals to be systematic and replicable, so does qualitative research. Qualitative research cannot be research that cannot be copied. It has to be replicable. Okay? So be very clear for the steps that you are following in terms of how you collected the data. Explain it in a way that people read it and go, so-and-so did it this way, I will follow this process. Make it a model for others to replicate. But for you to write your steps, you first have to justify or link your data collection from previous research. What have previous papers done? Now, if you're targeting a specific journal, my suggestion would be look at that journal's previous studies. If they've published something in Qualitative and it's similar, or you're getting inspiration from him, from the authors about what you should be doing, follow that, cite that. That's what you want to do. And the last part of your study being replicable is to make sure that you can triangulate. Don't rely on just one source of information. Okay. So if you're doing interviews, that's great. And some people will say interviewing 3 different types of people will be sufficient. No, that's not triangulation. Triangulation would be, if you're doing interviews, are you using something else with it? Are you making field notes when you're going and researching to get the context and the sense around that? Are there documents that you can read? It could be policy papers. So for those of you doing an economics-based study, economics is very much based on this macro-micro phenomena. So, well, what are the policy issues there? If you're studying that, read the policy, interview the people. If it's a government agency or private, doesn't matter. You go and meet them, see what's happening in the organization. You make field notes, the context in which this study is being done. That's how you can get triangulation. If you can justify it, and there's many, many books on qualitative research that tell you how to justify and triangulate, you are making your study replicable. You're making your study reliable. Okay? So far, 5 tips have taken us from setting up your project to all the way up to making your study replicable with data collection. Here comes the next step. And this is, again, a more recent phenomena that we as qualitative researchers have to follow. And that's tip number 6. Replicable, now you make your study reliable. Okay? So let me again ask you this question. You've got interview data. You've interviewed 20, 30 people. How do you analyze it? Do you just read it and say, okay, this person is saying this? That's a bit difficult, isn't it? Because that's your interpretation. How do you analyze the data? You can use interpretive methods, but how will you check that? How will you test it? The traditional way was manual coding. You would try and find out words, highlight them, and then try and see if you can put them under themes. Okay. Problem with that is it's a limited study, because especially if you're going to go converting a language, if you're collecting data in one language and changing it to another and then coding it, it's going to lose some meanings. So there's a lot of things involved in it. People will use thematic analysis, but also use things like content analysis or discourse analysis to try and understand what the meaning is or what the message is trying to tell us. Okay. Now I'm just looking at some of the questions. We'll try and answer some of these as we get along. But again, you know, it depends. Just a question I can see about how many people do we need for data. If you're doing a mixed method, it depends, you know, how big is the population and what you're doing. Are you doing two distinct studies or not? And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Some of my PhD students have done mixed methods where they've interviewed 36 to 40 people initially, and then they went and did a survey. Again, what was the purpose of doing that? Was a survey was being done in an emerging economy where previously there wasn't a survey instrument available that captured the cultural needs. So interviews first, and then use that to fix the survey method. Okay, so there are ways around it. So first thing would be, how are you actually analyzing? What method are you using? The second would be, are you still manually coding it? And if so, how reliable is your manual coding? And I can see someone has just mentioned in there that they use NVivo software. Absolutely. I try to use two where possible. What you're seeing on the left of your screen is Leximancer. It's a software which does automation. So I actually use a combination. And the reason I use the combination is because in my area, which is more international business and strategy, qualitative research is something that started gaining more acceptance in the late 1990s. So it is still early days for it. So what I do is I first manually code, then I use Leximancer, and what Leximancer does is it just takes the text. You can feed it PDF, Word, or whatever. And based on that, it will try and make these connections, as you can see on the map. And the bigger the bubble, the more significant that particular word or topic is. So I will manually code, then run through Leximancer and see if it matches. If it does, then you can see the third step. I use that to generate NVivo search queries, because NVivo doesn't automatically do so much. NVivo is more about the researcher feeding some of the information to it. So regardless of which software you use, and there are many more qualitative softwares as well, it's very important that we start moving towards this so-called scientific method. We start using more software, because that's got a greater acceptance now. And more universities are now providing these sort of NVivo type software to their staff and students, where historically SPSS would be the standard software that students would get. So again, there's a good science here, but we have to do the hard work behind it. Tip number 7, we're getting to the, out of the 10, we're getting to the end. So tip number 7 here. You've now done your thematic analysis or whatever analysis technique you've used. You've now presented your findings. How do we know that your findings are reliable? Same question that we've had with all the issues with qualitative. If you're going to make a statement and say the interviewee said this, then you have to provide a quote or few quotes, because it just can't be one quote that you provide. You'll have to provide multiple quotes. And you can't just have one line. A one-line quote is not detailed enough. It's not in-depth enough for us as researchers to make clear findings from it. It has to be a few quotes. It has to be quite detailed quotes in where people can explain the context to us. This is not a survey yes or no question. You're talking about qualitative research. The beauty of qualitative research is it's detailed, it's in-depth, it's providing you context, it's explaining things. So again, it's not easy. It's harder, but it's very rewarding. So you need to provide that evidence. Okay? And that will again help address any concerns the reviewers may have, or help any concerns that the editor may have. Okay? So moving forward. Tip number 8. Make your discussion section very strong. And this is where, if you flip it around, quantitative researchers are being asked to do what qualitative researchers have historically done. If you think about the quantitative studies that are published in the past, the emphasis would be highlighting hypotheses, explaining where the data was collected from, how it's analyzed, and then whether the hypothesis was supported or not. Okay, and then people would just finish off by saying, well, the hypothesis was supported, this wasn't supported. That's it, a little bit of summary in the end. Today, journals are going back to quantitative researchers and saying, no, we need a discussion section. What exactly does your hypothesis being supported actually mean? It's the same for qualitative. Okay, we can't just have a discussion section that merely summarizes and says, this is what I found. No, that's not enough. Need to actually discuss the findings. And when I say discuss, you need to discuss as in, what does this mean? What does this contribute to the literature? What does it contribute to the theory? What does it contribute to practice? So this again goes back to our question or our quest at the start. What is the purpose of your study? What you said at the start, your discussion section should be addressing that, should be answering that, should be reaching a point where you can say, yes, this is where my contributions are. Okay. That's tip number 8 for you. I'll give you one more tip and then I'll give you a perspective from the editor side of what happens in the background that you perhaps as an author don't get to see. Tip number 9, finishing off your paper. How are you going to finish it off? You have to finish it off. As a qualitative researcher, you have to finish it off by providing guidance for future research. Qualitative research is undertaken, as we said, to find out why, how. It's quite exploratory in many senses. It hasn't been done. You're trying to understand things. You're not trying to test the effects. You're trying to understand why things take place. So you have to provide some sort of guidance, and more journals want authors to provide propositions, because these propositions in the future can be taken by quantitative researchers and tested as hypotheses. Okay. Practical implications, very important. Your paper shouldn't just be about academic authors. So as I said at the very start, my role with the Journal of Knowledge Management is I'm the real impact editor for Oceania. My position is just above the regional editors. And the reason I'm there is to try and engage more with the practitioners, get them involved in publishing, making sure the academic papers are written and presented in a way that it's understandable for the industry. There's no point us sitting together writing papers where we read each other's papers and it makes no impact to the industry. So we have to make an impact. So it's very important that we highlight the implications for practice as well. So let's go from an editor's perspective. And while we're at that, I'm just quickly looking at that question as well. Predator journals. If you see a predatory journal in Scopus, stay very clear of it. Overwhelming majority of journals in Scopus will not ask you for money. So there should be no submission fees. And there shouldn't be any fees for acceptance and publication. Okay. Fairly straightforward. You shouldn't be paying for this. Now, there are some journals, some top journals that will ask for a submission fees, and that's essentially just to discourage people who don't really read the journal. They just want to submit a paper and hope that it gets in. So they just want to reduce that. It's to discourage them rather than to encourage predatory behavior. Scopus does do a test or check every year. If they find journals that have a predatory behavior, where they're asking authors to pay so that they'll publish, these journals get kicked out. They may be Q1, Q2, they'll get kicked out. Okay? And there are some that I know personally are being reviewed right now because those journals are of good ranking, but they are going around asking for very huge sums of money for submission fees. Stay clear of them. So what happens from an editor's perspective for Scopus? If a journal is in Scopus, you've got two pressures. One is you have to make sure that the journal meets the minimum standards, and that includes the standards for COPE, which is the Consortium of Publishing Ethics. So as an editor, it is my responsibility to make sure that the decisions made in the journal are done so in an ethical manner. Also means that I can't be resorting to predatory behavior. Okay? So my journal is published by Emerald. There is no fees for submission. There is no fees for publishing. There's no fees for acceptance. It's free. Okay. Only if you have to get subscription, you pay for it. But Emerald tends to sell subscription to universities as a package anyway, so you wouldn't have to worry about it. So as the editor, it's my responsibility to make sure that when Scopus checks every year, they see that I'm maintaining the quality and I'm maintaining the standards that they're expected of it. Standards in quality, but also standards in ethics. Not only Scopus, Emerald as a publisher will also be checking that, because if one journal in their publication house is seen as being unethical, it affects the overall reputation. Okay, so there are pressures there. The third thing we all have to understand as authors is journals get their visibility through citation. So it's very important, if we want to enhance our chances of getting published, that we read the journals, we see what papers are there, and we cite the papers that are relevant. It makes no sense to submit a paper to a journal that you haven't cited anything from. Not that it's compulsory, because it could be a new idea and that's fine. But if it's an idea that has been published in the journal and you haven't cited the journal, from an editor's perspective, the very first signal that sends is perhaps this person hasn't chosen this journal as their first preference or hasn't read from this journal. Perhaps they're just submitting it because they failed to get this paper in somewhere else. So very important that you read, cite the paper. And editors will also look at the paper you are submitting and say, will this paper or does this paper have enough relevance for it to be cited in the future? That's why I was saying, when you're talking about your research in Indonesia, you have to bring it in the context of the global economy, or at least in the regional economy. Especially if you're looking at one island or a region in Indonesia. Most studies on countries will talk about countries. Regional studies, there are some journals who look at that, but again, they'll do a comparative regional studies. So will a study on an island in Indonesia be sufficiently cited in the future by other papers? If the answer is no, then the editor might have questions. Is it viable for me to publish this paper? Does it help generate interest in the future? So what's the initial things that we're looking for? Very first thing, if it's an Emerald journal, have you followed a structured abstract? If you've given a one paragraph abstract, straight away that's a signal you didn't bother looking at the guide for authors. You have to really match the expectations. If it's Emerald, I know it's going to be a structured abstract that they'd require. Fix a structured abstract. Emerald, for example, again, doesn't need JEL codes. If you're providing JEL codes, again, it's a signal this paper in somewhere else got rejected and the authors haven't changed that. Okay, so there are signs that editors will look at. If it's a journal, say if it's journal knowledge management and I'm handling the paper, and if the title has and the abstract has nothing about knowledge, it's a straightforward reject. If it's review of international business and strategy, and the title and abstract has nothing about international business, doesn't cite any literature that's from the international business field, it's a reject. It just doesn't match the scope. Now we have to understand the number of papers that come in are huge volumes. So editors can't really send every paper for review. It has to be only the relevant ones. Okay? My journal is not the topmost journal in the world, but again, we've got a huge rate of rejection. We reject 70 to 80% of the papers that come in. Okay? And more than half of that is desk reject. And if you look at some of the top journals, they only have a 5% acceptance. Okay, 5% acceptance. And we're talking about, say, Journal of Management Studies, etc. They get 3,000-4,000 papers a year submitted. And if they're lucky, they'll do 5%. I would say even less than that. 5% of those that are not desk rejected, let's put it that way, not the overall ones. So provide very clear things in the abstract, what you've done, why you've done, what are the key findings. If it's Emerald, do it in the abstract, structured abstract form. It's the others, follow the structure that they've identified. Your introduction should be, because editors will read the abstract and they'll read the introduction and they'll check the reference list. Make very sure in the introduction you've highlighted what the issue is, what the problem is, and it's written in a very good way. Okay? Edit it. Reread it, make sure it's done in a way where the last thing you want is for the reviewer and editor to be annoyed about the language. And again, if you are familiar with Emerald publications, that's one of the questions that the reviewers get. The communication, the language used in the papers. So make sure you don't give the reviewers and editors an easy excuse to reject your paper. Okay? The review process itself, every journal has different expectations. Some journals will do 2 reviews, some will do 3 reviewers, just depends on their journal itself. And it can be anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, even more. My journal takes about 4 weeks, 4 weeks from when the reviewers have accepted. So the whole process can take a few more weeks. It could be 2 weeks before reviewers are found and they accept, and another 4 weeks before the reviews come in. Sometimes they're late. So you're looking at least 2 months. On average, 3 months would be after which you could prompt the editor and ask if there's any update. In my area of international business, average is 4 weeks of review. But again, as I said, finding reviewers and then factoring in the fact that reviewers can be a week or 2 late. We're looking at about 2 months as a process. All Scopus journals have to follow a double-blind review. So minimum 2 reviewers that do not know who the paper is from. Okay? That's a minimum number. Some journals, as I said, do 3. What can the editor do? Well, as editors, we get the paper. We do the first checks to see if it matches the scope. If it matches the scope, the next thing we have to do is find reviewers from the database. Sometimes we will not have expertise in that area. So then we'll look at the reference list and find people who are experts in that field and ask them to review the paper. This can be time consuming, but this is what editors will do. Now, once the review is done, the editor will check and should check for the quality of the review. If it's a one-line review saying paper is very good, minor changes, acceptance, yes, no, that's not going to be good enough. An editor will not make a judgment based on that. They will either ask for another referee, or they will ask one of the review board members to quickly check and provide some feedback. Depending on the overall recommendations, they'll make a decision on whether to accept the manuscript. Very rare there'll be an acceptance after the first round. Major revisions, minor revisions, or even rejecting the paper. Papers can be rejected after the first round of review, sometimes even after the second or third round of review. If the suggestions are that, look, major revision, reject by the reviewers, but if the editor feels that now there is some hope here that this could make a contribution, the editor can give a major revision or ask the authors to make the changes and resubmit as a new manuscript. Okay, so if the editor is convinced, there's a lot more the editor can do. So editors do have powers. But as qualitative researchers, and this is very relevant for qualitative researchers, because qualitative research, once it's rejected, especially if it's rejected that you don't have enough interviews or go and do more interviews, it is very hard to salvage it, but you can. Okay. Understand the fact that no editor likes to just say reject for no reason, because every editor is an author, and there is not a single author who's not been rejected. Everyone gets rejected with the papers they believe are the best papers. They still get rejected. Okay. What we have to do is use the rejection to understand where the weaknesses lie in this paper and how to address them in our future papers, and then submit to another journal. That's why I said have at least 3 journals in mind that you can quickly flip through. And when we were talking about software, I would say, please use a reference management software as well. Be it Mendeley, be it EndNote, I use EndNote. And the reason I use it is, if I've got 50 references, I don't want to manually go and change it every time I have to change a journal. I can do that through the EndNote system. Very easily change the style from one journal to another, and it automatically fixes that. So we have to, again, be quite strategic about it. Okay? Thing would be, don't give up. If you're confident and you believe that your paper is good, then it will be published. No matter how long it will take you, it will get published. Okay? You just have to believe in it and do the work that's required. Let me give you an example of this, and then I'll finish off by giving you my tip number 10, the final tip, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion. On your screen, you're seeing a paper. Looks very nice there, received on the 25th of March, revised 29th of July, and accepted on the 31st of July. Now that's in Journal of Business Research, which would be a Scopus Q1. The history of this paper is that it was started in 2017. And 2017, we did this paper, and 2018, we won the Best Paper Award at a conference. And since then, it has been rejected or was rejected by 7 different journals. Some through first round of review, some in the second round of review, some desk rejections, with the view that this can't be saved. It's not really a good paper. We strongly believed it was. We submitted to the Journal of Business Research. It got published. When it became available online, one of the authors we had cited actually picked up this paper and tweeted about it and said, this is a really good paper, one of the best I've read. I highly recommend it. And this paper has been getting a lot of downloads. It's a qualitative paper. It's interview-based, data collected from China, and it was expatriates. So when we were asked to go back and get more data, those expatriates weren't there in the factories anymore. But we still followed them up, did follow-up interviews, got some more interviews where we could, but we continued on. It was very easy to give up, but we didn't give up. So it finally got published. and we're very proud of it. So it does take time, and that's why you can't just rely on one paper. You need a pipeline. So if one is going through this process, this very lengthy process, you need others, so that one rejection doesn't push you off. You have other papers that can hopefully get you through. So my number 10 and final tip for anyone who is a researcher, but especially for qualitative researchers. Be respectful and get involved. If you want to learn about things, you have to be part of it. Be respectful because editors and reviewers volunteer their time. They read your paper not because they get paid for it. They do it because they feel they can contribute, they can help you. The respectful part comes in that you check that your manuscript is formatted according to the journal style, etc. What the pandemic has done is there's a lot of cost cutting now. So publication houses aren't going to have people who will go through and do the initial checks anymore. It comes straight to the editor. And if an editor is dealing with 30, 40 papers a week, they don't have that much patience to go through and check each paper to make sure it's 8,000 words when the journal says 8,000 words, it's following the right style, etc. Have these things done beforehand. Is your reference consistent? Is it reference according to the journal style? Have that consistent. I see my reviewers get very frustrated and they write the first few paragraphs of the referee report to authors saying, please show respect, follow the guidelines. Okay. Have you read relevant papers published? If you're saying it's a very new area, no one's done it, and it goes to people who have published, they're going to ask you, why didn't you cite them? Why didn't you cite that paper? Okay, they can't say, why didn't you cite me? They'll give you reference to a few papers. Maybe one of those references may be theirs. If you're saying it hasn't been done, but it's something in that journal has already published something relevant, they're again going to say, well, why didn't you even cite this? Have you not read the journal? Because if you're not citing that, you're not engaging with the journal, you're not engaging with the journal's readers. If you get to the point where you get a revise and resubmit, again, show respect. Make the changes where possible. Where you think the changes cannot be made or should not be made, respectfully explain that in a response to the reviewers. Don't just say, we don't think it's a relevant argument. You're not going to make any friends if you give that sort of a response. Okay? Reviewing a paper takes time. People have put in their time, they've written a report for you, show that respect to them. Take your time and do it in the allocated time. Don't start the last week before the revision is due and again, rush it. Don't rush it. Reviewers are trying to help you. They've got no other intention but to help you get published. But they're also gatekeepers. They can't let every paper get published. That's not of quality. So we've got to take advantage of it. And my final tip would be, take advantage of the opportunities you get for networking. Okay, last 2 years we've been doing this virtually, but prior to that, even virtually, there's nothing stopping you. Engage with the people. You've got an editor come, or you're meeting people at conferences, talk to them. Chances are, if you talk to people and you say, this is the area of interest I'm doing, would your journal be interested? Immediately you're getting feedback. The editor can tell you, yeah, that could be of interest. Why don't you send me a paper? Okay. So before submission, an editor may even look at your paper and tell you, make these changes before you submit. That gives you a better chance of the paper getting to the review stage. It won't be a desk reject at least. So take that opportunities and network. It can be at times overwhelming. You may feel like, I don't want to go and approach it, but we're all the same. We're all researchers. We all started with our PhDs and early career. So, it's no different. Approach people. Maybe if you've approached the editor, also say you're interested in learning a bit more and volunteer your time to review papers and do a good job if a paper is sent to you. Because if you do a good job, then the editor is more likely to send you more papers and invite you in the future to be on the review board. What it also does is if you're reviewing papers for that journal, you get a better sense of the quality of the papers because you review it and perhaps you think it's a minor revision. You put in a minor revision and then you get the reviewer update from the editor saying, we've given this a major revision. And you get to see the other reviewers' comments as well. You get a sense of what's going on. You learn from it. Maybe start that with conferences. Conferences are always looking for reviewers. Volunteer your time, learn from that, hone your skills, then volunteer for journals. Part of your author role, also have a reviewer role. This is how we all develop our skills. You get to learn new research, you get to read papers, you get to see what's good and bad. And once you are in a position where you're giving feedback, you are more understanding of the feedback that you will receive. So you're more likely to understand the reviewer's perspectives. Sometimes you can disagree. If it's a reject and you go, they didn't understand the paper, that's fine. You move on and you correct or fix up the paper. So the next journal you send it to, you've addressed it and clarified so that you hope the reviewer can understand it. Don't take a rejected paper and submit it the same as it is to another journal, because you don't know, you may end up facing the same reviewer somewhere else. And if they see the paper without any changes in another journal, they're going to inform the editor, this was rejected by me elsewhere, and they haven't made any changes. It's not a crime to resubmit a paper. Don't submit the paper at one time to 2 journals, but always only to 1. But don't just submit the same paper without any changes after it's been rejected. That's again part of that respect and courtesy you give to the community, because editors also communicate with each other. So they do share experiences, and they may say, well, I have this paper, and the other might say, well, we just rejected that paper. So you don't want to be in that position where you've submitted something without any change. So those are some of the things to keep in mind. Now, hopefully these slides will be made available to you. I'm happy to make that available. If you get a chance to just, when you're writing papers or planning papers, just keep those 10 tips in mind. I hope that they will help you in addressing some of the issues, and be assured there are journals now in finance that I've seen, in accounting, that will only take qualitative papers. So one of them has just got a ranking in the Australian Business Dean's List, QRAM, Qualitative Research in Accounting and Management. They will not publish anything quantitative. It's a place only for qualitative, okay? So qualitative papers are growing in acceptance. There's much more chance of you getting published now than it was, say, 10 years ago. But it also means that we have to show respect and do the job in a very professional manner, that we can justify why we're doing things. Okay? So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your patience, and be more than happy to further the discussion. And as I can see from the chat, there are a lot more questions as well. So let's go through them as well. So thank you again, and I'll stop my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ramal. It's very great tips, actually, because as the PhD students right now, we're facing the difficulties in publish our qualitative papers. And on the other hand, writing the qualitative research also is not that easy for us. Then we have to publish it. Actually, my dissertation also in qualitative, it's difficult. It's make me, oh my God, it's like I come to the hell, but I have to finish it soon. Okay, there is the questions in chat box. First questions is come from Irwan Toib. The question is quite technical. If the population are 200, then how many that we have to interview? It's technical, I think.
It's technical, but it's also, let me put it this way. If you were looking at law firms, right? So imagine there are 20 lawyers and each firm has 20 lawyers and there are 10 firms. Now there are 200 lawyers. Do you want to get the views of all the lawyers, or do you want to get the views of the partners or the senior lawyers in those organizations? So it would depend on the purpose of your study. What are the questions you're asking? If you know what exactly the population is, even if it's qualitative, the editor will ask, well, why didn't you interview everyone then, right? So I would suggest that best to have your questions in a way where you're saying, well, I'm only interested in how the senior, for example, senior managers or senior lawyers, the partners in the law firm, hire or recruit new lawyers. If that's your question, then you want to get the population of the senior lawyers / partners, and perhaps as a reference group, you can have other lawyers as well. Maybe 20–30% of the lawyers that are there. There's no set amount for it, but again, it would depend on the question. So yeah, quite a technical one, specifically to point a number for it.
Yeah, and the next question is come from Tanjung Agustini, Doctor. It's so if we want to combine qualitative and quantitative, so it's like mixed method for village tourism area. What number sample we need to collect for each?
Yeah, so again, this would be related to the last one. If you're doing a mixed method, which this would be the case, just remember there are always questions about how much detail you'll have to provide, okay? So you're doing a mixed method, you need to think about breaking it up into two, okay? So there are two ways of doing it. Some people will do the qualitative part first because they want to understand a bit more about the context and what they will do before they do the survey. And then they do the survey. And then they will publish the qualitative and then they'll publish the quantitative separately. In some cases, people do the quantitative first. And then based on that, they will do, from the findings, they go, well, we need to understand why this is happening. And then they'll go and do qualitative to try and understand, provide reasoning for it. Okay? So it depends on the purpose. If you're doing qualitative to try and fix up your survey instrument, then I think from what I've read in some of the qualitative ones, again, depending on the population, you'd be looking at least close to 30 interviews minimum. If you're doing it the other way around, where you're doing quantitative first and then trying to just understand things, then it depends whether you're using a case study in a qualitative, where you're looking at one organization, interviewing a few people, or whether you want to go and say, well, I'm going to interview 10, 15 people. That should be sufficient. Depends how you publish it. If you publish it as two separate studies, then you'll need a few more interviews. If you're publishing it as a quantitative study with a qualitative explanation, then 10 to 15 interviews will do as well. So it depends, there are some quantitative ones where you can get away with 120 because the relationships you're testing between variables, that should be sufficient. There are some where you need 250 to 300 because you're using SEM and all these advanced things where you have many, many variables, moderators, mediators. So again, it just depends on the question and the technique that you're following.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ramal, for the answer. And this is the question from Ronald Stiobowo. It's about how actually how the strategy we choose the journal in India. Maybe it's mean that many predatory journals from India. So how we can avoid the predatory journals?
Yeah, it's something we discussed earlier. It just depends on your approach. So if you're in India, and in India, there's a push towards using the Australian ranking system, the ABDC. My thing would be that you want to look at the ABDC, not just the journal ranking, but also the publisher. Okay, so if you're seeing a publisher's name that you're not familiar with, be a bit careful. I mean, if they're asking you for money straight away, no. Okay, so unless it's a really top journal that, as I said, wants to discourage just massive submission, just no, don't pay for submission fees, because those predatory journals can be caught out and then kicked out. So by the time your paper gets published, it's no longer on Scopus. So if it's an Emerald, if it's an Elsevier, if it's Palgrave Macmillan, these are respected publishers that have been around for decades. So you know they won't be kicked out. Okay, but if there are some, and I've seen them from Eastern Europe, new publishers, they've done that. They've raised their ranking quite quickly and then been kicked out. They're predatory in nature. So yeah, I think if you just go through the list in Scopus, see how old the journal is, reliability of the journal means there's more chances you'll avoid that situation.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Here is the question from Wulan Adiarti. So Wulan Adiarti has the qualitative research in one of Indonesian school in Kuala Lumpur. Is it ethically not allowed in qualitative research to mention the name of the school where the research is conducted?
It depends on the institution. So if you're doing a case study and the institution is quite happy for collaboration and they want you to publish the name, that's not an issue. But if part of the agreement you have with them is that the name of the institution will not be published, and no different from, say, the name of organizations, firms that may be there, then you can just mention that it's a school, public, private, wherever it is, you don't mention the name. So it just depends on the ethics approval that you've received, and you go from there. So there is no issue. It's just a case of the agreement between you and the organization you're collecting data from.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's go to next question is from Bu Mirna. Bu Mirna, can you open your microphone? You can ask the question directly. Bu Mirna? Okay, so here the question, Doctor. She needs the suggestion about the mixed method. Firstly, she used qualitative method and want to explore something new, such like strategies. So the first research question is how the strategies to implement the system. Then she bring it to quantitative method and distribute the questionnaire. And the question is, what about the research question in the end in the manuscript, using how or what?
Okay, so if you've done the qualitative one to do the exploratory, that's probably given you a bit about the kind of strategies that are being employed, and now you want to check them or to test the influence of them. That's what I'm understanding from the question. In the what I would say is, in the paper itself, because you're doing a mixed, you don't necessarily have to say the research question is. What you can say, the research objective is to identify, for example, the key strategies applied by all managers, and to test the influence or the outcomes of these strategies on, say, organizational performance or profitability. So you can put it as a statement of saying that this is the purpose, or this is the task, or whatever you say it. You don't have to put it in the context of a question. And you'll find many mixed method papers talk about the objectives of the study rather than saying the research questions. Because when you're talking about the hypothesis, you will capture some of those things. So yeah, research objective might be a better approach for that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Dr.
Mbak Mirna.
Yes, because I'm a little bit confused how we can state in our manuscript, because you said that you replay that identify to test we can state, for example, our purpose, something like that. So not it's not really, what is it, sir? Explicit, you know, I mean, very detailed about our research. So then in the mixed method, can we use that to purpose, for example, to accommodate the to explore, to accommodate the first purpose is explore the strategies, and then we want to test something like that. Sure.
Yes, it's just so what we would, if you say propose, then it's a, I would say, because you're exploratory in nature, but you're identifying the strategies. So I would actually use the term to identify the strategies, and then you can have it as a second part of testing or whatever you want to call it, more as an objective thing. But I think if you say objectives and to identify, a term like identify or highlight, you're basically saying you want to bring it to forward. So it's in a way proposing that, hey, this is important. So if you identify these issues, then you test them. That's a good mixed method. What I'd recommend, because I'd have to see a bit more about what the research is all about, but what I would recommend is there is a journal of mixed methods. And unfortunately, that's one that doesn't get cited too much in mixed method papers. So I would say check that journal and some of the papers and see how they've done it, because they only publish mixed method paper. So yeah, that would give you at least a style in which that would be similar to yours.
Okay, many thanks, Prof. Hussein. Maybe I need your, what is it, the title of your research previously. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Mirna, for the question. And I please Irwan Toib to ask directly. The screen is yours, Mr. Irwan Toib.
Can you hear me? Yes. Professor Rama, I would like to continue my question before, when you asked about the number of respondents, you said population, right? And then I asked 200. What I mean by 200, if, for example, you are having a responder of Fortune 500 companies, mean that you have 500 CEO. I don't want to, you mentioned before that, okay, choose which one, but the CEO is 500, right? So the population is actually 500. That one thing could be very large, or in the other way around, if you have one particular industry in Indonesia, for example, like my colleague here, I think he's also in this webinar, his industry is only consists of 6 companies all over Indonesia. If we don't have access for all of those 6, how many at least minimum to represent those industry? So in a large scale, like 500, or in a small scale is 6 people, 6 CEO, how will you consider that the population is representative enough to be justified? Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. That's actually a very good question. So let me put it in the context of what would happen. If you take the Fortune 500, and if you manage to get all of the 500, then just imagine, the editor is going to say, sorry, no, because you can just imagine 500 people even giving you 1,000 words to write, that's too much.
Maybe I don't need to do my research if I have that access already.
Exactly. If you've got that access, you don't need to worry. But what I would say is you've kind of answered your second question with that. What I would suggest is if you have those potential 500 and you're not going to interview all of them, you go, well, from that, I'm going to choose the 500 in this particular sector. Right. So within that, which industry they're in, you can choose that, narrow it down, and then do it even further from that. So that would be one way of going to it. Now, the other point you made of 6 firms, but spread across and they can't get access to all of them, that's where you can certainly bring in Ying and Eisenhardt's justification. Because if you are getting very in-depth data from 1 or 2 firms, even one, I mean, Yin and Eisenhardt both say, if you get one that gives you really in-depth data, you've got multiple people you can interview there. As long as the issue you're covering is unique, it's new, that's sufficient. Because you'll see papers will say, this is, again, very exploratory in nature. That should be fine. 1 is enough. 2 or 3 makes it even better. You don't have to cover all 6 if you don't get it. If you can, that would be absolutely brilliant, because then you don't have speculation that what might the others be doing. You know it all. But if you can't get all 6, then 1, 2, whatever you can get, but it has to be really detailed and in depth to give it, enough support to the editors that, hey, this is well done research and it should be okay. So
at least in your journal, we usually hear that in the dissertation level, in the doctoral degree, you cannot have a study in one particular company, right? You have to cover the industry. But with sort of very strong justification, you can still have one company. Is that what you mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about dissertation is going to be quite different from a research paper, because a research paper is going to not take 4 years of your life, right? Okay. Research paper is going to be faster. It's going to be targeting something quick, especially phenomenon-based. You want to get it out before that phenomena becomes old. So people will try and explore something really fast and take case study example. At the moment, if you look at some of the papers that I've read, a lot of good journals have published on a single company like Huawei because of the 5G network. They've just said, Huawei 5G network issues with politics, it's a phenomena, do it. One study, I think it was published in a Financial Times 50 journal recently. So that can be done. But again, it was quick because it was current. If you're doing an established one can be sufficient. If it's a really big one, it's a market leader, etc. If you can get more, great. Otherwise, if you've only got 6 firms, access is not an easy thing, then yeah, you can justify it through those Ying and Eisenhardt as case studies.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ramal. Really appreciate your advice.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little bit quiet, interesting actually, the answer and the discussion. And we hope actually Dr. Ramal can come to Universitas Brawijaya and we can talk together directly.
Inshallah.
COVID.
After COVID, inshallah.
After COVID. Right here, I think this question is, I mean, almost most of us has this question that about the station actually, Dr. Ramal. So do we need actually to cite many stations that have exist in the journal in paper that we submitted? This question is come from Sofia Andini.
Okay, it's a very good question. Now, it depends on the journal. So my journal and many journals in my area will not go beyond 7,500 words. Okay, there are some journals that if you hit 10,000 words, and if you put in there that you've got 10,050 words, they'll send it back to you and say reduce it. And that's inclusive of references. So you want to make sure that your references are not too many. So avoid multiple references, but also make, so here's an insight, if I can give you from an editor's perspective. Scopus, when it does its ranking, it looks at citations in the last year for papers published in the journal over the last 3 years. Okay, so if you're submitting something in 2021 that's likely to get published in 2022, 23, you want to cite papers that are from 2021 or 2020 from that journal, okay? Because if it's from 2017, even though it looks relatively new, Scopus ignores it, says, no, that's not going to help. So yeah, journals will have that pressure. But even if there is nothing in there, what editors would want is not for you to cite something from 1980s or 90s. Cite something new, because it just shows then the issue is current as well. So it's not so much about citation. It's also about that. But the quality of citations, please be aware that that's an issue. You're putting in a Scopus ranked journal, your citations have to be there. Now, we do get papers from China, Indonesia, all of those where there are papers in those languages, which is fine because that's where you need to acknowledge the publications. But if it is in, say, published in China, in Chinese, in the bracket in the reference, provide the English translation of the title, right? And where possible, link, if it's not a journal that's easily available. If it's online journal, put a web link, just like you would for a web page, so that the editor can check that and choose reviewers accordingly as well. So yeah, be very careful of your citations. The more high quality top journals are being cited, it gives confidence to the editor that this is a topic that is current and will make a contribution. So that's how you want to look at that.
Okay, so the first thing we have to do before we do research is read the article from the top journals, is it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. And we have to make the mapping for the articles, for each article of the top journals, then we can cite it very well in our paper.
It's very
and
good.
This is the last question, I think. Do we need to put some part of the interview result? The interview is reliable. This question is from Virginia, Doctor.
Okay, so sorry, just slightly broke off. But if I'm getting it right, you're asking whether we need to put variables for.
Do we need to put some part of the interview?
Okay, yes,
for the
yes,
qualitative.
Absolutely. So with the qualitative, two things that are emerging. One is in the actual data analysis, that editors are coming back and saying, how did you come up with these key findings? So usually they'll want a box. If you look at NVivo, they talk a lot about creating nodes and trees. So you'll have to create, if you're saying the first thing, say if you're doing something that's related in economics, you're saying macroeconomic policy, key finding, the influence of that. Under macroeconomic policy, what are some of the keywords that came up that you highlighted, or how did you come up with that theme? So you probably have to provide a table and say from the interviews, these were the main things. Then within the findings where you have these findings presented, you would want to provide quotes from the interviews that are relevant there. And you want to make sure that your quotes are from different stakeholders. So interview 1 says this, interview 3 says this. Can't be for each finding, it's interview 1 all the way, right? So it has to be different people, different voices. You capture that and provide a thing. Some places you'll say interviewee 1 said this, while interviewee 3 agreed or disagreed and said this. So you provide the evidence that they're all saying the same thing, or they're contradictory in some senses. But yeah, that's how you will provide that context.
Yes, exactly. Because actually in qualitative research, it's difficult for us to prove and to make the interview is confidence. Actually, it's not like the quantitative research, Doctor. In quantitative research, we have the secondary data that the source is like World Bank, it's trusted source. But in qualitative research, most of us has difficulties how to make it reliable and to validate the data actually. But thank you so much for the material today and the answer, very great answers. And we hope we can continue for the qualitative tips in the next session, because we need like the NVivo programs, techniques, and how we can put the interview result in the paper. And it's actually something new for us to publish the qualitative research in the top journals. Thank you very much for the material for the session today, Prof. Hussein Ramal, and keep happy and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Baik, untuk teman-teman peserta, silakan untuk bisa mengisi IKM yang sudah di-share di chat box untuk mendapatkan sertifikat. Dan kita besok ada acara lagi untuk Next 3-in-1 program. Jadi acara kita akan berakhir di hari Kamis tanggal 28 Oktober. Dan untuk besok acaranya adalah business coaching. Dan silakan untuk bisa mendaftar atau bisa langsung WhatsApp ke nomor saya, nanti kita akan share linknya. Well, Dr. Ramal, thank you very much and goodbye for everyone. Keep healthy and stay happy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Oh, photo first, Dr. Ramal. Please, photo first. Photo. Mas Agus, please. Okay, for the screen, keep smile. Second screen. Okay. Done? Okay. Thank you so much and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you tomorrow.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you, Prof. Hussein and Mbak Sylvie.